you look at this, okay, so far, when you look at chapter 9, we were dealing with one sample t-test. So we talked about a population, then we talked about the population standard deviation, we talked about the population mean, then from that population a small sample was drawn, then we were given the sample, the data on each person from the sample, then we calculated t-test, standard error of the mean, SM, standard deviation and all those things. That was one sample. Now here we are shifting gear a little bit. We are going to look at two sample t-tests. Now when we are talking about these two samples, they are not from the same population. They are two different samples. No relation at all. So these are independent sample design. So if you look at the first paragraph, let's look at this page in your, it should be in your handout. It's underlined. So we want to compare the means for two groups. So the two sample tests involve testing hypothesis about the difference between the means to determine or to find out if those two means from the two samples, they differ significantly, meaning if the difference is statistically significant. So there are two different ways to do it. This one, in this chapter, we are dealing with independent samples. And then next chapter, we are going to deal with related samples. So those samples, they will be related to each other. But these two, completely different samples. So what do we have? If you look at this sampling distribution of the difference between means, then we are talking about two samples. Remember the sample size, when we write sample size, we use that lowercase n. Since we are dealing with two samples, we'll be using n1 and n2. So what are the steps we have? Looking for the steps, this is what we need to follow. So look at the very first page of this handout. First thing is, we are going to look at these two groups of samples, and then once you are given this exam question or any of this question, it will tell you whether you are going to do a non-directional test, meaning not equal to non-directional, or a directional test. You will be given that information. So based on that, first thing we do is we formulate the hypothesis. Second one, again we are dealing with a t-value, so we look at the alpha level and then we decide on the critical value. Then we calculate the relevant statistics. So we have to calculate x1 bar, or remember the one we were using so far, m. It's the same thing. So x1 bar, meaning if this is a sample, then from this sample we have to calculate the mean. Since this sample is n1, so the mean from this sample will be x bar 1. This sample will be n2. So mean from this sample will be x bar 2. So x1, n1, x2, n2. And then we calculate this sum of square. I have given you the formula, and it's also on your page number 133. I gave you the page number. The next thing, the difficult part here, remember before we were calculating the standard error of the mean, the formula was a whole lot easier. Since we are dealing with two samples, is much more complicated. So that's the formula we are going to use. I will give you the formula in your exam, so don't worry about that. You will have it. So we have to calculate the standard error of difference between means. Once we are done with that one, then we can calculate the T obtained. And once we calculate the T obtained, next step we will make a decision. Another complication in this situation is, if you are looking at, remember we did that size effect coherence D? It was a much easier formula before. It was like m minus mu divided by Sm. Very easy formula. Now this formula is quite complicated. Have you seen it? There we go. That's a really complicated. So again, but in terms of the range, like effect size, it's still the same effect size. Remember that low effect, medium effect, high effect, is still the same thing. So the values for low effect, medium effect, high effect is still the same, but the formula is different. So that's how we are going to do it. Don't flip out, you'll be fine. Trust me. But next time, please follow the steps. It's much easier to do it. Write down the information given to you. On left hand side, write down those things first. And then go step by step. It will be a lot easier for you to comprehend. Even for you, when you are working on it, it will lead you step by step. Otherwise, some people, I mean, I'm not going to say who these people were.